We now turn to our third panel. Hope you've all enjoyed a good lunch. Corporate governance is key to creating the right structures and behaviours to secure growth. The Quoted Companies Alliance recently published, we published our revised corporate governance code for small and mid-sized quoted companies. And this emphasises the important role that good governance plays in attracting further investment and delivering growth in long-term shareholder value. It would seem from the voting that took place before lunch that the vast majority of you believe that good corporate governance does bring business benefits. But what we're seeing within the corporate governance area are quite a few developments. And we've compiled for you today a panel of speakers who will cover many of the current hot topics, including reporting, pay, and shareholder engagement. Please join me in welcoming our panel and its chairman, Edward Craft, who's a partner of Wedlake Bell, and he chairs our corporate governance expert group.
Thank you, Tim. I need to start with an apology to Dick Steele. This session concerns his bugbear. No, that's not funny sandwiches, but the issue of corporate governance challenges in the current environment. I do hope that an hour from now we might have been able to at least start to shift the views of one man from Burton upon Trent. I appreciate that there may be a long road to travel in that regard. However, we must try. As Tim said, I'm Edward Craft, corporate partner at the mid-size law firm Wedlake Bell. More relevantly, however, is the fact that I chair the corporate governance expert group, and we've spent much of the last 6 months revising the Quoted Companies Alliance Corporate Governance Code for small and mid-sized quoted companies. I'm delighted to have 3 experts on this panel, each of whom will share some of their particular wisdom and insight with us. I welcome on my left Matthew Stallabrass, partner at the accountancy firm Crowe Whitehill and chairman of the Quoted Companies Alliance Financial Reporting Expert Group. Gemma Peck, deputy director at BIS, who's recently been handed the governance portfolio, having successfully navigated the design and implementation of the new remuneration regulations. And Jean-Nicolas Caprasse, head of European business at ISS. Given the final question of earlier, I do hope Jean-Nicolas, you'll be able to shift some of the views about proxy voting. Each member of the panel will present on their particular issues for approximately 10 minutes, and then we'll open up to some questions. Earlier today, Lawrence Marsh and Kamal Ahmed spoke of some of the costs and disadvantages of being on a public market and some of the things that have gone wrong, what was described as the stagnant lake. I hope that we're now moving to a phase where good governance is part of a company's strategy for growth rather than a shackle to it, part of the fresh water. I'm just going to take a few minutes just to refer to the new Corporate Governance Code which we produced earlier this year and launched last month. Just to confirm to those in the know, I did not today try to cycle to the station. We tried very hard to make the new Quoted Companies Alliance Code a document which is accessible and digestible to all in the SME arena. Most importantly, something which will be useful to company directors. I'd appreciate some feedback on this issue in due course. We've tried to make our new code a useful document to all SMEs, whether on the main market, AIM, or ISDX, and also to those privately held growth companies which are looking to put in place the right building blocks to graduate into a traded environment. I consider the next major challenge in our work as the QCA's corporate governance specialists for us to do all within our power to make the principles laid out in both our code and the FRC's UK Corporate Governance Code, to bring those principles to life. The theory of good governance is of little value unless it becomes embedded into corporate culture. And I do hope that the QCA document goes some way to try and do this. Of course, that's easier said than done, and I look forward to receiving your observations on how this can be achieved and the challenges we face in the discussion towards the end of the session. Anyway, without further ado, I welcome Matthew to speak about narrative reporting and related accountancy issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edward. Before anyone wonders, unlike the earlier 2 sessions, we're all under a 3-line whip to sit here and do our presentations. It's been an established wisdom over the last few years that annual reports and accounts get longer and longer. And I've seen a number of reports produced by a number of bodies that have set out that fact. And indeed, I think the current record goes to this year's annual report from HSBC, which came in at just under a whopping 600 pages. But what none of the reports that I've seen actually does is establish a direct relationship between the length of an annual report and its usefulness and its quality. And indeed, I think it's this problem that's been touched on by a number of the speakers that we've had this morning. Lord Younger, in his address, talked about some of the changes that BIS are making to narrative reporting and the reasons that they're doing this. And he talked about reports being bogged down and lacking in clarity. It's been noticeable that we've had other people who've spoken and some questioners from the floor who, when they've explained their business, one of them said it was to release the burden to allow directors to run their business. There is a sense that annual reports and accounts have become bogged down with clutter, tied down with regulation. And this is just what I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about. Is this something we should care about? Does it actually obscure important information, or is regulatory compliance an end in itself? Where does all this clutter come from, and is there anything that we can actually do about it to improve reports and accounts and narrative disclosure? Well, first of all, I think that clutter does actually matter. Clutter obscures important information and inhibits clear communication. And I think this is preventing something terribly important. We've heard from fund managers before lunch about how one of the things that they're looking for is some clarity about a business, a clarity to understand its strategy and its business model, clarity to understand its performance and the remuneration of its directors. And clutter obscures that particular clarity. But where does clutter come from? I think there's 5 different sources, and sitting here as an auditor, you'll be pleased to know I'm going to take 20% of the blame. Yes, clutter comes from us auditors who approach things with a checkbox mentality for compliance. Clutter comes from accounting standard setters who look at each individual disclosure and think, yes, that's a jolly good idea. That bit of information is useful, but fail to actually look at the overall totality of what's being produced and ask whether the volume of information obscures what's important. Clutter comes from regulators who, unfortunately, create an atmosphere of fear, people wishing to avoid inquiry by the FRC or the FRRP. Clutter comes from government or other regulatory bodies such as the European Union, who sadly feel that the annual report should be the repository for all sorts of information, instead of being a key document for communication to shareholders. And it also comes from preparers who take the easy route of actually saying, it was there last year, so we'll leave it there this year. So what can we actually do about it? I think that there's much that can be done, even within the current framework. First of all, businesses need to plan in advance for their narrative reporting. Actually take a cold look at last year's. Think about what was good and what could be improved. Make a plan for reporting. Put someone in charge of it, has overall responsibility for the document. But also make sure that everyone who contributes to that document knows what they are seeking to achieve. One example I can think of narrative reporting contained a report in the front end, one report written by each director, probably because they thought it was important for their own egos that they had a separate report. But unfortunately, it was terribly repetitive. The chairman, the chief exec, the finance director all basically said the same things. Yet in a business, those 3 individuals had 3 very different functions. Their reports could have added a lot of value if they'd each concentrated on their respective functions. a chairman focusing on strategy, business model and governance, a chief executive talking about performance, and a finance director focusing on working capital and cash generation. What could have been a very powerful set of reports turned into a monotonous series of documents. The other thing that can be done is actually for people to be clear about what is material and what is immaterial. One of the things that the International Accounting Standards Body has been discussing is this definition of materiality. Actually, people are putting in a lot of immaterial disclosures and missing or obscuring the important and material disclosures. But do you actually have a key idea in your minds as to where you think that line falls? What is material and what is immaterial? So that actually people can approach their auditors or regulators, whoever it might be, and have that discussion. We talked earlier with the fund managers about actually engagement with shareholders, engagement with the people who use the accounts, actually asking them what they value, what they would like to see, because that's probably a fairly good indicator for what's important. And the things they're not telling you they value is probably a fairly good indicator for where the clutter lies in a set of annual reports. The final point I'd just like to leave with is just some thoughts perhaps for the future and some thoughts just around current changes. Gemma will no doubt touch on the changes that BIS are making to narrative reporting. And actually a lot of these, I think, will help the position. I think inserting a strategic report that forces people to clearly and concisely explain their strategy and their business model is helpful for users of the accounts. We've heard numerous times this morning about how important it is for people to clearly explain the link between pay and performance for directors, and the changes that are being made to remuneration reporting, again, I think help that. But what I would like to see regulators and governments take a little look at and hopefully change over the next few years is actually getting away from a focus on a single written and printed document and thinking about its electronic presentation. I don't know the statistics for your particular sets of accounts, but I would suspect the vast majority of them are accessed online. Yet how much thought goes into online presentation compared to thought in about a printed document? I would like to see governments actually look at changing requirements, take things out of annual reports and put them in standing documents on a website that can be updated at different times of the year. I think that would one of the things that would help make annual reports and narrative reporting focused on the needs of shareholders, yet allow other important information to be readily accessible to all stakeholders in the business. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Could I just ask you a question? Whether you are optimistic or pessimistic that preparers will rise to the challenge of writing good strategic reports? I'm
an optimist. My glass is half full, not half empty. I think that I think there's been a lot of talk around this problem of clutter, this problem of obscuring information. There's been a lot of talk about what's important to shareholders and the importance of being clearly articulating strategies. And yes, I think directors will rise to that challenge and will make sure that they clearly articulate that in a strategic report. I think where my pessimism comes and where the real challenge is actually in years 3, 4 and 5 of the implementation, to stop those sections on strategy being boilerplate narrative that's simply copied from the year before, but actually turns into narrative that is refreshed and reflects the evolving nature of the business.
Because there is a challenge there, isn't there? Because the strategy should be consistent, but the way in which that is being displayed will evolve. Yes.
I mean, the strategic report talks about strategy and business model. And yes, even if a strategy is consistent, the business model may well change. But it is making sure it's showing what's consistent, it's showing what's changed, and it's reviewed and refreshed as opposed to being left as a stale document.
Thank you. Gemma, now over to you. You're going to speak a little on BIS's current policy initiatives and experience of what has been going on there to date.
Yes, particularly executive pay. Excellent. So firstly, thank you very much to the QCA for asking me to come and participate. It's always good to get out of the office, and actually it's really valuable for policymakers like myself to get out and talk to people who are affected by what government does and to hear your reflections on the impact. Those preceding me today, including the Minister this morning, have already talked about the importance of good corporate governance in creating the business environment for growth. The coalition government feels very strongly about this, and indeed embedded in the coalition agreement is an ambition to strengthen the UK corporate governance framework. Over the last 3 years, my Secretary of State for Business, Vince Cable, has personally driven this agenda forward, working very closely with business, investors and other regulators. We've had the K review, which identified ways in which we could work to restore a more long-term approach in the way that companies and investors operate. Working with Lord Davies, we've made substantial progress on increasing the diversity of boards, although much more to do there. And soon Parliament will, I hope, give its final approval to our reforms designed to improve company narrative reporting, which Matthew has talked about. But the reform which has had the most attention, and which I've been asked to focus on today, is of course the government's action to tackle excessive executive pay. And the question on everyone's lips at the moment, it seems, is will the reforms work? Are we going to see any difference at all in how people are paid? But before I tackle that question, a quick reminder of where we are today, how we got there, exactly what are the changes we're making. So the action on this really got going in 2011 when the Secretary of State for Business, concerned about too many cases of what appear to be rewards for failure, spoke at his party's annual conference and discussed the issues and published an initial consultation exploring what government and indeed others could do about the issue. And I think this consultation back in September 2011 set out very clearly what the government sees as the issue. So I will read a direct extract from it. The government is very clear that generous rewards for leading executives are not an issue. Executive remuneration that is well structured, clearly linked to the strategic objectives of a company, and which rewards executives that contribute to the long-term success of that company, is an important way of promoting business stability and growth. However, over the last decade, the link between pay and performance has been hard to discern. And this suggests two possible issues. One, that the structure of remuneration does not necessarily incentivize directors to act in the long-term interests of a company, or that the level of remuneration may represent an excessive reward for the actual performance observed. And this general disconnect between pay and long-term performance suggests there's something dysfunctional about the market in executive pay or a failure in corporate governance arrangements. And so the government invited views on how shareholders and companies could potentially promote a clearer and stronger link between pay and performance. And there's been widespread support for this debate, as both investors and business have recognised that there's a problem, that failure to address it would be bad for the economy and would damage public confidence in business. So, having considered a very wide range of possible actions, the government made a very conscious decision not to intervene directly in how or how much people are paid, although it's been interesting to observe other countries recently, notably Switzerland and France, opting to go down that route. Shareholders, as the owners of companies, are ultimately the ones responsible for judging whether or not pay is appropriate. And so the government's reforms focus on ensuring that those shareholders have the information and the tools they need to make informed judgments and challenge companies in a meaningful way. And the reforms which come into force on the 1st of October this year do two things. They give shareholders more power through a binding vote on pay policy, and they boost transparency of pay reports so that it's clearer and easier to understand exactly how and how much people are paid. The new binding vote has been implemented through primary legislation, and that was finalised as part of the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act, which was granted royal assent in the spring. The reforms to company reporting are being implemented through secondary legislation, and that legislation was laid before Parliament last week. It will be debated and voted on within the next 3 to 4 weeks. And so then the full set of legislative reforms will be finalised. In the long and actually very challenging process of designing these reforms, we have constantly had to bear in mind the need to strike a balance. And that's between ensuring that shareholders have got access to clear, consistent and comparable information and have a meaningful binding vote, while still giving companies sufficient flexibility, ensuring that boards remain ultimately responsible for designing pay and not expecting shareholders to micromanage. And this has been trickiest on sensitive issues, complex issues like, for example, exit payments, where companies don't want to be straitjacketed and investors don't want them to be either. I hope that we have found the right balance. Crucially, the legislation needs to be complemented by guidance and good practice, which is driven by and shared between companies and investors. There is a GC 100 and investor working group who have been working on guidance to sit alongside the legislation to set out what they see as good pay reporting, and this is really welcome. I'm sure that in due course there may be a role for the QCA to set out and guide how the new framework can work best for smaller and medium-sized quoted companies. I don't doubt that there might be teething problems in parts of the regulations where companies aren't sure what approach to take, but I know that practice will evolve over time as companies and investors work out what works best for them. And those companies with clear and sensible pay structures and with good relationships with their shareholders should find this system easy to adapt to. And I hope that many smaller quoted companies will be in that position. In addition, the option of only putting a pay policy to a binding vote every 3 years will favour those companies who are able to set out and stick to a longer-term pay policy. Again, I hope this is something that smaller quoted companies can take advantage of. It's an element of the reforms that the government faced a lot of criticism for by those who saw it as a watering down away from an annual binding vote. But we fought very hard to keep it, seeing it as something that would encourage a longer-term approach to pay and would be a good option for those smaller companies with less complex pay arrangements. So finally, coming back to the question on everyone's lips, in, say, 2015, when the government's reflecting back, looking at these reforms, what do they hope to see? Well, firstly, more and better shareholder and company engagement. That is critical. And early feedback is that that has got better over the last 18 months. Secondly, that companies have got clearer, longer-term pay strategies. Thirdly, a reduction in rewards for failure. And ultimately, a stronger link between pay and performance. Of course, our ministers will want us to continue to monitor how company and shareholder behaviour evolves in response to these reforms. This year, we've seen an increase in pay taken home by directors, and that's largely as a result of awards made 3 or 4 years ago, which have now been realised. But the size of new awards being paid out have actually increased only moderately this year, which is encouraging. We haven't seen this year yet many high-profile major disputes over pay, as witnessed in last year's so-called shareholder spring, although shareholder dissent in smaller quoted companies has actually risen. But high-profile pay disputes are not the mark of success for these reforms. Ultimately, if we see fewer disputes because companies and investors have been working better together to agree on sensible pay packages, and crucially, freeing up more time to spend talking about other issues like company strategy, performance, and risks, then that will be a very good thing and a mark of success for these reforms.
Thank you, Gemma. I found it particularly interesting in your analysis of the situation that there was partly a concern that control over pay should stay at the board, lest there is an abdication of responsibility from the board to shareholders, and that's another aspect that I hadn't picked up on until now. So many thanks for that. Jean-Nicolas, many thanks for travelling across from Brussels to be with us today. Now turns to you to give us some insight on corporate governance from the perspective of an engaged proxy advisor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As you can, and thank you for the invitation to be here this afternoon. As you can imagine, I was very interested in the vote that you expressed this morning on providing your opinion on proxy advisors. So you have elected me the bad guy of the day. And that's perhaps one of the reasons why we have decided not to stand on the podium, so you can't throw tomatoes at me. But
no, you're the good guy because you're here talking to us.
Yeah. I'm brave, let's say. But anyway, I will spend a few minutes in trying to shed some light on what is the role of proxy advisors as essentially intermediaries on behalf of institutional investors and helping them cast votes at general meetings. But let me just address the first two questions that were asked to me for this afternoon. What is the impact of the stewardship code? And what are the key issues that companies should be addressing with their shareholders when it comes to corporate governance? On the impact of the stewardship code, obviously the stewardship code was released in the UK in 2010, with its first update already in the autumn of last year, and essentially is driving an increased fiduciary responsibility that is imposed on investors, and mainly institutional investors, to act as good long-term stewards of companies in which they invest. There are other similar codes in other countries that also apply to institutional investors, and there is now one such code in the Netherlands, for example, in Switzerland, as Gemma pointed out. There is also an upcoming one in Italy. As a matter of fact, it is also one of the cornerstones of the action plan that the European Commission released at the end of last year, which is essentially to provide more rights on shareholder pay, but not exclusively on shareholder pay, but also to impose more responsibilities on them, again, to act as stewards of the companies in which they invest. So there is a body of regulatory and soft regulatory trend, complemented by some market trend, and I can mention here the initiative of the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, that is essentially pushing investors to become more active and to be better stewards. So what is the impact in the marketplace? I can see two or three. First, we see more voting activity. This right that is given to shareholders to express their views once a year at the general meeting, also when there are extraordinary meetings. And if we look at the attendance rate in the UK, for example, it has risen from roughly 66% on average 5 years ago to 74% last year. We also see more engagement, in other words, more dialogue, and hopefully meaningful dialogue between the shareholders, and you had some of them sitting in front of you this morning, and companies in which they invest. We also see an increasing factor that governance, an increasing trend rather, that governance is more and more being analyzed by the portfolio managers and by the institutional investors as a risk factor. In other words, if there is a lack of alignment, there is possibly an issue for the shareholders investing in companies. And to that end, we see this trend materializing by the corporate governance teams at the large fund managers in London and elsewhere, working more and more closely together with the portfolio managers to identify whether governance really aligns the interest of shareholders with those of the management, or whether there are some issues worth picking up. Which, if you flip this side of the coin, is talking to the necessity for companies to try and gain and retain the trust of the shareholders when they invest in the companies. That brings me to the second point, which is what are the key issues that companies should be talking about in terms of corporate governance. I think it's very important to remind ourselves of the proxy voting chain, which is very time sensitive during the spring of every year, at least in this part of the world. Hence, transparency and disclosure is paramount, and also timely disclosure of all the information that shareholders are interested to learn about the corporate governance arrangements of listed companies in which they invest. Most companies operate under a comply or explain regime, which means I think it's a good thing to refer to the code that you're supposed to apply, either the UK Corporate Governance Code for the larger companies, or indeed perhaps the QCA code, why not? When the company decides to deviate from a code provision, I think that much attention should be brought to the rationale and the explanation and the quality of the explanation provided for reasons for deviation and why a different approach is deemed appropriate in those instances. And then it will be up to the shareholders and indeed the advisors to assess the quality of the explanation and to taking it on board or not. The key issues of corporate governance, there are four main pillars, which I summarize in A, B, C, D, pretty easy. A standing for the audit, everything that has to do with the auditors, the external audit, the audit fees, audit nomination, etc. The second stands for the board composition, the board diversity, checks and balances, committees on the board. The third deals with, to Gemma's point, compensation, so all the remuneration schemes for long-term, short-term and long-term incentives. And the last one stands for anti-takeover defenses, and more generally speaking, the shareholder rights, as expressed usually in the Articles of Association. And I know that top of the agenda for UK investors often comes the preemptive rights. Now let me say a few words about the role of proxy advisors in this arena between shareholders and companies. We are yet another intermediary, but we should not be between, to refer to a comment made this morning, we should not sit between you and your shareholders, so we should not sit between you and your wife, essentially. The role of the proxy advisory industry is very simple. It's essentially to help institutional investors, client of the proxy advisors, to make informed voting decisions at general meetings, both ordinary and extraordinary ones, of companies in which they invest and where they wish to express their views. So let me illustrate this with ISS, because I'm not really entitled to talk on behalf of the entire industry here. It means in practice that we are going to analyze and cover any general meeting of a company that is held at least in one portfolio of one of our clients. Practically speaking, this means that as regards to the UK, we are covering virtually all FTSE all-share companies, all fledgling companies, and all AIM companies. On a global basis, we cover in excess of 44,000 general meetings every year in 115 markets, and we do this for approximately 1,300 institutional investors in the world, 300 of them in Europe. This is obviously a global offering, but that we do on the basis of a very strong local footprint to make sure that we analyze and that we take into account the local specificities in each market. So we do have an office in London with about 12 analysts reviewing all the general meetings of UK and Irish companies. We are very open to dialogue with companies. And as a matter of fact, we favor it. But I should explain the objective of the dialogue, the way we see it on our end, is essentially for us to make sure that we have gathered all the information and all the explanations necessary to inform our report and to enrich the quality of the reports that we send to our clients. Because we are advising our clients on how to vote, they are always the ones taking the final decisions of the direction of the vote. So in other words, as intermediaries, we are not entitled to vote on behalf of our clients. That is, I think, something very important to highlight. Which means also because we are advising clients, sometimes, by the way, based on different underlying voting policies or philosophies, if you'd like, which means that we may end up advising different clients differently for the same resolution at the same meeting. It also means, as a consequence, that we are not activists. In other words, it means we don't have any specific interest to induce change at companies or to force a specific outcome at a general meeting of shareholders. So to that extent also, when we talk to companies, we do not act as consultants. In other words, we will try, the content of our dialogue with companies will be limited to two main aspects. As I explained on our end, we welcome receiving all the information that is necessary and that will help our analysts make a fully informed analysis leading up to a voting recommendations in most instances. We also can gladly take the opportunity to discuss with companies, and we indeed talk to a number of AIM companies as well, to explain our philosophies. And by that I mean mainly the underlying corporate governance policy that we apply when we analyze resolutions. Again, for larger companies, we here for the UK apply the NAPF policy, and for the AIM companies or the smaller companies, we apply the NAPF voting guidelines for smaller companies. These are public documents that can be easily be referred to. So, to summarize, we welcome the interaction with all of you listed companies here in the UK. Obviously, this does not replace direct conversations that we encourage you to have directly with your shareholders, all the ones that are on your registry. Perhaps one last question that was already asked over lunchtime is, do we allow companies to review a draft of the report that we send to our clients? I think that the answer is that to all the extent possible, we will allow for that, provided that you ask for it in advance. We do it systematically with some of the largest companies who have been asking it to us year after year. We will do it on the best effort basis with any company asking for it. There is, however, a limitation, again, linked to the time pressure imposed on our clients, and as a result on us as well, to cast vote before the deadline, before the cutoff deadline imposed by the usually the custodian, the sub-custodian, or the registrar, which means that sometimes the window of opportunity for our clients to review the material and to take the voting decisions can be very short. And as a result, in advance of that, when we provide the draft, sometimes we have limited time to give you an opportunity to review it, which can be 24 or 48 hours. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Nicolas. That final comment is actually quite interesting, just thinking about when companies schedule their company meetings. And I'm actually wondering whether that needs to be linked in to, for example, where weekends fall, to actually try and give more time for this process to work beneficially rather than rather than be perceived to be negative. But building on another point you made, one with which I wholeheartedly agree, I think historically far too often the word explain in comply or explain has been viewed by companies as being identify, point out non-compliance. That is not an explanation in my view. That's just flagging something. What companies really need to do is tell the story as to why X behaviour is appropriate for it and not Y behaviour. And then it is incumbent on either the shareholder or the person advising the shareholder to actually understand that explanation. They may not agree with the conclusion, of course, but take it on board. And I think that's a key part of the maturing of the governance relationship between the various stakeholders.
And we very much welcome the work that the FRC has done to look at the quality of explanations and to try and further that debate. And it's something that has come up increasingly over the last few months at a European level as a result of the Commission looking at corporate governance, producing its corporate company law and corporate governance action plan, and exploring this concept of comply or explain, which is now very much established across Europe. And it's fair to say that the Commission has some questions and reservations about whether or not that approach is robust enough. And one of those, the key to that is where companies do choose to explain rather than comply, how they're explaining that, and are shareholders then armed with the information they need to make those judgments. And so it's great that the FRC have been very proactive and have been kind of talking to their counterparts in other member states about how they can share their experience of how you promote better explanations. And that's really helpful, and that's something that they have been kind of working with the Commission on and sharing that output, which is really helpful.
Yeah, no, certainly something I really picked up when I had a meeting with the Commission as part of the Corporate Governance Company Law Action Plan was that the UK was being painted as the good guys here. And so much of the work is actually about other jurisdictions. And I just wonder whether because obviously I was out there representing the QCA, when you go off to Brussels, you're representing the British government, whether you get the similar relationship in this area.
Yeah, we've been working very closely with the Commission and sharing our experiences of the various issues that are explored in the action plan, and that includes executive pay, company reporting, investor voting disclosure, where, yes, the UK is in a position in many of those areas where our thinking is further advanced, or indeed our regulatory frameworks are further advanced. And so, hopefully the Commission have found it very helpful that we have been very open in sharing our experiences. But you're right that I suspect, and we will see more details of where the Commission is headed after the summer. I think autumn, probably late, it will be late autumn. And I suspect that in many areas what we'll be seeing is the Commission putting forward proposals that would encourage other member states to come to a similar level, or perhaps not even as far as the UK has gone, rather than something which is going to send the UK kind of leaps and bounds beyond where we already are.
Do you think we would then get put under pressure to fall to minimum harmonisation?
I don't think so. But of course, in negotiating it, that is something that we will be looking for.
I think we really should try and now open matters up to the floor. So I hope that some of you will have some questions for us. Yes.
Thank you. Dick Steele, Portmeirion Group. I make the finest tableware in the world, but I meant to mention that.
I do remember you, Dick.
First of all, very brave of Gemma and Jean-Nicolas to come today. I think very brave of them. Let me give you the user's perspective of proxy voting. It comes in at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. They give us 24 hours to explain or to comment, and they're not interested in explanation. It is a pure tick box approach, normally out of the Caribbean or the Philippines or somewhere, which a 12-year-old can fill in at the other end. And it is very, very irritating that you've tried to explain and you're not allowed to explain. So I would argue with you on that point. I would make the second point about voting by shareholders at AGM. You mentioned 66% and 74%. I'm not sure whether that's shareholders voting. It is certainly not my experience. Getting shareholders to vote, even by proxy, is like pulling teeth. It's very, very hard work. I then want to come on to the point about government, and this is why it's quite brave of Gemma to appear. They would be better to lead by example. Let me take you down a few storylines here. Look at the universities. The universities' remuneration disclosure is back with the 65 Companies Act. It is ridiculous and appalling. Look at how we had to fight to get MPs' expenses on the agenda. It is ridiculous. Look at the BME stroke diversity in the cabinet and previous cabinets as well. It is so far out, it's just unbelievable. And I actually think government would be better to lead by example rather than trying to fix a problem which probably isn't there. And let me tell you why I don't think the problem is there. In my own company, what would be far more important would be for shareholders to know, compared to peer companies, how much we spend on repairs and renewals, or advertising and marketing, or product development, or training, rather than directors' remuneration in total.
Thank you, Dick.
So I'm not going to touch on proxy advisors, but I will respond to some of your challenges on, firstly, I'll take your last point first, which is around what is really of interest to shareholders, and where I hope that one of the reforms that we're making to pay reporting, you will agree, is helpful, and that is encouraging companies to illustrate what their spend on pay is compared to what their spend is on other kind of material outlays for that company. And we've allowed companies flexibility to pick what are the things that they want to report on that are meaningful for them. So it provides context for the debate on, the quantum of pay. So I hope that will be helpful. On the rather bigger challenge of why is the government meddling in pay when it itself needs to sort out universities and MPs, clearly a great deal of that is beyond my remit and not terribly appropriate for me to comment on. What I would say is that I am confident that many in government would share your concerns, and that my Secretary of State would be very keen for government to be leading the way on some of the areas you've identified. He is very passionate about the diversity agenda and trying to get more women on boards and more women coming through. And of course, with a colleague in amongst BIS ministers being Jo Swinson, who's also Minister for Equality, amongst BIS there is a real drive on that front, and indeed we're across BIS very much encouraged to be looking at other opportunities to promote diversity, not just through women on boards, but other ways as well. On transparency around pay, and there are lots of different bodies and organisations out there and different regimes for them, but the people in government responsible for looking at kind of setting those rules are very interested in looking at what can be learned from what we're doing for quoted companies, and have been talking to myself and others in my team about how they try and bring some of those other regimes up to a similar standard to promote kind of the type of best practice that we want to see in companies.
Okay.
Jean-Nicolas, I think there's an example of proxy bad stories.
Yes. So let me try to address your points as well, and thank you for raising them. First, to correct perhaps your own word, we say, let me take the point of view of the users. I mean, in our view, our users and our clients are the institutional investors. They are not the companies. And then it is up to, on your second point, which is the one of dialogue. First of all, let me point out that there are a number of different proxy advisors out there. As a matter of fact, there were 7 answering a consultation run by ESMA at the European level in the spring of last year. We are only one of them, so I can talk to our own position. Because indeed, the proxy advisory industry is split on whether and how to engage in a dialogue with companies. Some will take the view that they don't want any conversation at all in order not to be influenced in the analysis and the output that they send to the clients. We are of a different view, where we believe that a dialogue with companies can help us gain a better understanding and hence improve the quality of the research that we provide to our clients. Now, on this window of 24 hours, I may have stick to that one a little bit too much. As a matter of fact, I just alluded to the fact that the proxy season, as we call it, so the time of the general meetings, usually in the spring of every year, is very condensed, is very hard work for, on both ends really. When we talk to corporate secretaries, they are underwater deeply at that time of the year. We are too. So to that end, we welcome conversations with companies throughout the year, and especially outside of proxy season. And I would advise all companies who have deviations to code provisions to come and explain those to the shareholders and indeed also to the advisors ahead of time, either when they contemplate them or when they are already in place, to provide a rationale for those, which then diminishes the heat on the small window of opportunity during the voting process. And the third one is on the quality of the research teams, I guess. We have, just to reiterate, in London, a team of about 12 analysts. Some are very seasoned. They've done 10, 15 proxy seasons already. They know the companies inside out. They have established contacts with usually corporate secretaries, sometimes investor relations of CFOs of companies, to make sure that all those links are established ahead of time and to provide quality research for our clients. And I think the last testimony to the quality of the research that we provide to our clients is that over the last 5 years, since I've monitored this on behalf of ISS, we've had a renewal rate of our clients of 94%. So quite surely they were deeply dissatisfied with the quality of the research we would be producing, they would go elsewhere.
Thank you for that, Jean-Nicolas. I just want to take this opportunity just to flag up something that we reflected into the QCA code. Jean-Nicolas welcomes discussions on departures from the expected throughout the year. We have not with that in mind, but set out a set of minimum disclosures. Firstly, that companies should have an annual report and accounts, but more important, well, more relevantly here, on their company website. So we believe that this is information that companies should be narrating as the year progresses, and I think that is part of creating this greater understanding of each other's respective positions. I've actually got a question for you, Matthew, just building on something that Gemma raised, which was the parameters for disclosure in relation to pay and against what it's benchmarked. There does seem to be a growing trend in government to suggest that companies can decide which parameter they benchmark against. And greenhouse gas reporting, I think, is probably the real case. I have a personal view that it would be great if there was a standardised basis and people reported to that. I know that's not a view that would be universal within this room. I just wonder, from your perspective, from the audit industry, what your views are on choosing your own benchmark.
I see why people like that, because it aids comparability across different companies and different industries. But I think my fundamental problem is actually getting a benchmark that is relevant to each individual company, and I'm not actually sure that is possible to do, to get the same benchmark to compare executive pay for someone like HSBC compared to a sort of FTSE fledgling company. So I think I'd take a slightly different view to you, Edward. I think it's important that companies choose what they think is an appropriate benchmark and clearly explain why they think that is the most appropriate one to choose. The one other comment I'd just like to make in response to the question on executive pay, I'm actually quite comfortable with the position of where we've got to on a lot of this. You know, I do think it is very important that companies explain the link between pay and performance. And I don't particularly have any objections to shareholders having more of a vote. What I have been incredibly disappointed about is the tone of the debate around this whole area. And this isn't a party political point, because I think they're all equally as guilty about it. To my mind, the pay of the directors is the business of the shareholders, and the job of the government is to make sure that the shareholders have the information to make an informed decision. What it is not the job of government to do is to give a running commentary on whether they think this individual or that individual, whether it be in a bank or any other company, is paid too much money.
Can I respond to that?
Of course.
Because I think we have come. I absolutely hear that concern, and you won't be surprised to know that that's a concern that has been voiced to myself, my colleagues, and to ministers a great deal since we started looking at the issue of executive pay. You know, not just my ministers, but those across government, including in number 10. But I do think that we have come a long way, and we have improved and developed the narrative to be more helpful. You know, when this started, yes, there was quite a lot of unhelpful jumping on the bandwagon, and it was quite negative. But I don't know if it's been picked up, but, you know, for example, you know, Vince is not really talking about pay quite so much anymore, because it's not particularly helpful to just keep on raising it, because we know that it can be quite damaging. And he would much, you know, like us to be getting into a place now that we're more positive in talking about the developments that we have seen and the improvements in engagement, the fact that many companies have shown early adoption of the new reforms and have been really proactive and innovative about thinking about how to improve pay reporting, welcoming action like the guidance that's been voluntarily developed by GC100 and an investor working group to support and complement the legislation. And we're really taking as many steps as possible to keep on reiterating those positives now, and we'll continue to do so when ministers have the opportunity. I mean, some of this is, it's now actually, you know, it's rather bigger than just a debate in the UK. And, you know, since, you know, for example, the referendum in Switzerland agreeing to rather more draconian measures in this space, European reforms through Capital Requirements Directive targeted at banks, which impose statutory ratios on fixed to variable pay, and other developments that are being explored across Europe and in other jurisdictions mean that this debate, you know, keeps on going, and that's not something that, you know, we can control from the UK, because it's a global issue. And for as long as those things are being explored in other countries, it's going to continue to be out there. But hopefully we're in a position now of being able to talk positively about the journey we've been on here, the debate we've had, the extensive consultation we've been through, and hopefully the sensible conclusion we've arrived at. The fact that we've now got the legislation almost through, you know, hopefully all done and dusted in 3 weeks. And as I said, we're seeing positive action and people being proactive. And so if we can keep on kind of building that and sharing that message with those other member states and others who are looking at what to do about this, then we can kind of share positive experiences from the UK.
No, a debate has been had, and now we move to another phase, don't we, in
Yes.
relation to those issues.
You know,
Anyway,
I'm not being naive. I will say, you know, the gap will be filled by something else. It's
Of
not
course,
that,
yeah.
you know, Vince will want something else to say in his speeches, but you know, hopefully we'll keep it positive.
So, any more questions? Moving on from executive pay. Yes, at the front.
Yes.
Have you got a microphone?
Tony Scott, non-executive director in several companies. I won't mention them because the questions don't relate to those specific companies. One of my concerns, and I think most AIM representatives, AIM company representatives here, must be that AGMs in this country are generally very poorly attended. One of the real problems is that institutions make a point of rarely attending. And thus, when proxy votes are announced and counted, and particularly when negative proxy votes occur, there's no explanation given from the floor by the institutional representative, nor any explanation that's been often given to the company as to why they have elected to make a negative proxy vote. As a service to shareholders in general, I think it would be very helpful if institutions were made to give some explanation for why they're recording a negative vote on particular items, particularly on directors' pay. If there's good reason for that, then all shareholders should know what that reason is. I would also say that in my experience, quite often when I queried this fact with representatives from institutions, they have said, oh, it's the backroom boys that are insisting as a matter of principle that we should vote negative on questions of pay. Again, if it's purely a backroom boy issue, then this warrants far greater exposure and explanation to shareholders than has been given at present. Secondly, so really, conclusion, I would suggest that it would be very helpful that if a negative vote is being given by an institution with a particular percentage that might result, for example, in a special resolution being then not passed, that a representative from that institution should be present at the meeting and explain why to other shareholders who perhaps don't know whether they should vote for or against, exactly what their reasons for that are. And that gives the company a decent opportunity to explain why they perhaps agree or disagree, as the case may be, with the negative vote that's been given. My second point is just generally, I think all of us here representing AIM companies wish to attract investors in this particular market. And in general, an investor who is thinking about making an investment or purchase in shares, generally he's got to only refer to historical data that's often 3-6 months or even more. Now, one of the main problems for investors is that they really should have an assurance as to what the cash position is of the company, particularly not necessarily at the time of the AGM, but also at the time of perhaps the company report. Information such as the bank facilities that the company still has not utilized but has in hand, budgets which maybe have been approved already by the board ahead of the AGM. Perhaps this should be released to shareholders. Future cash flow and capital expenditure, therefore, and the general financing outlook for the company is something which I think ordinary investors in particular should have explained to them. And when you consider that institutions quite often have had sessions with the company's management in advance of the AGM, and that data often is given confidentially to them, surely there's a further case then for this being extended to the shareholders themselves. I'm sorry to continue for long, but my question is there not a case for a requirement of estimates of future funding needs and potential sources of funding being envisaged by the board? Should this not be indeed released, or at least that the chairman should be able to respond to a shareholder question at an AGM as to what the current cash position is. At present, Nomad advisors will immediately put their hands up immediately when anybody asks the chairman, what is your current cash position? Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think you've identified a number of elephants in the room in that question. I think it really boils down to the question, is the AGM, which was a creature of the 19th century, fit for purpose in the 21st century? Should the AGM be used as a forum for explanations from one body of investors to another body of investors, rather than historically from the company to its to some of its investor base? It touches on Professor Kay's idea of the investor forum, perhaps, which has been an aspiration set, but yet 11 months on, there hasn't really been any meat on the bones of that idea so far. A lot of people, I think, have identified what it can't be. Nobody's really said what it is. And then the third question, I think to be effective, it would have to be a regulatory requirement that companies actually report on their cash position, perhaps on the day prior to the AGM, and there's an update on that, and then answers can be given on that piece of information. So there's an awful lot there. I'm pleased that all I have to do is marshal the question, and I don't need to respond to it. Matthew, I think as the key part related to finance, I think I'm going to bounce that to you to start with.
I'll start with the finance point. I appreciate where you're coming from, because I mean essentially what we're talking about here is going concern. I'm not quite sure a requirement to disclose a cash position on the day or the day prior to the AGM is particularly workable. I think I would personally have concerns that taking one number in a balance sheet in isolation is very, very easy to manipulate. You can quite easily delay payments by a day or two and give a very false and misleading impression through the release of that particular number. So I don't think I favour that particular thought. I think a lot of what else you've touched on about budgets, about giving a general financing outlook, about future funding needs, certainly if there is a change in that position from the balance sheet date to at least to the date the accounts are signed off, I would expect that to be disclosed. If there are doubts around going concern, I'd expect a very clear note in accounts, and actually I think it would be best practice to actually talk about some of this, about future funding needs, where the business might look for that funding. So I think you've got some interesting ideas, but actually I think the structure at the minute, if it's properly used and information is properly disclosed within it, probably meets a lot of those concerns. Just touching on the first question you had on the AGMs, it's an interesting idea as to whether institutions should be made to explain to the company a negative vote. I'm not completely sure I'm comfortable with that, but I can see its merits. I think it comes back to the point that I think was raised by our friend who I think does very good quality china and things in the corner here from Port Merion, where he was very much talking about investor relations is something to be worked at. And actually, if you are getting negative votes from institutions, it's a case of going to knock on their doors and trying to engage directly with them and ask them to explain why they've done that, and try and explain your position and why you think they shouldn't have made that vote.
I'm aware that we're going to run out of time quite quickly, so I'm just going to bounce to Gemma. Is the AGM fit for purpose?
Oh, I was rather hoping to follow up on what Matthew had just said.
Oh, right, sorry. You can answer that instead.
Yeah, I'm sure everything I'll say will then feed back to the point of, is the AGM fit for purpose? But I just wanted to remind people, of course, about the progress that's been made since the launch of the Stewardship Code, to which now, most major investors in UK equities are signed up. Getting those investors to disclose both their voting policies and their voting records. And, there are many good examples now out there of investors who will disclose, their full voting records and give reasons for that. Not everybody does it. It's not a statutory requirement, because to date the government has taken the approach that would rather not regulate for this, that actually would prefer to change behaviour and get people to see the benefits of making those sorts of disclosures. It is one of those issues that the European Commission is looking at and considering whether or not it should be mandatory. But I would totally agree with everything that Matthew and others have said, that there is the AGM, there is voting, but that is just one point in time. And actually what you want to see is a consistently good dialogue throughout the year, so that you don't get surprises. And both good dialogues between investors and companies, and as you alluded to, Edward, also it's helpful where it's where it's appropriate and useful for investors also to come together where that can be beneficial. And it is encouraging that now at least there has been established a working group of notable individuals in investment industry to talk about how they might be able to bring life to this idea of some sort of investor forum. And that's really encouraging, and we hope to see their recommendations later this year.
I was wondering if we've got two more quick questions to round up. If we go, the lady right at the back and the gentleman by the screen.
Thank you. Jocelyn Brown from the Financial Reporting Council. I just wanted to build on Gemma's points regarding the UK Stewardship Code. Under the code, it is best practice for investors to inform their companies in advance if they plan to put a no vote forward. So I would certainly raise that point. I'd also say in the code and in our discussions generally with investors, we always encourage them to go to AGMs and say that that can be of value. So again, those are both areas which we are very aware of and continue to encourage.
Thank you.
What I was going to say was that the Quoted Company Alliance represents small cap and AIM companies, none of whom have economic significance, which is going to destroy the economy, the banking system, the environment, or anything else. A lot of the rules, regulations, and codes on salaries, on bonuses, on contracts, on environmental disclosure is going to be affected by whether we disclose or not. What it does do is impose a level of compliance on small companies which can't afford the overheads. Is it really relevant for us? Surely we should be taken out of these major disclosures. I don't object to you disclosing on banks and large companies or whatever and what corporate governance, but for smaller companies, surely we should have some exemption for all these rules. And even on AIM to disclose salaries, what concern is it? AIM companies are often run by entrepreneurs, individuals. That's why you invest in them. Surely this is irrelevant to a lot of the major rules. I'm not against the major rules for major companies, but we should have an opt-out for smaller companies.
Okay. I think that's probably a very powerful point upon which to conclude, to really emphasise the point that SMEs cannot destroy the economy, but the reason why we're here is that they are one of the key engines of growth as we move to a new stage in our economic cycle, and it's the SMEs that are creating the new jobs to help us dig us out of the position that we were in back in 2008. So Tim, over to you.
Well, please join me in thanking Edward and the panel.